Welcome to Breast Friends Cancer Support Network. Your host is Michelle Beck. Our show is here to help breast cancer patients, survivors, thrivers, their friends, and family by providing resources, support, and inspiration they can use right now. Here is your host, Michelle Beck.
Hello and welcome to Breast Friends Cancer Support Network. I'm Michelle Beck. I am a two-time 9-year survivor of breast cancer, and I'm the patient programs assistant at Breast Friends of Oregon. And when I have time, I write at a blog called I Never Liked Pink. So thanks for joining us today. We are talking about a subject that I don't know a lot about. So for those of you who listen regularly, like, Michelle's awfully quiet today. And it's not because I'm not interested, it's because I don't know a lot. So I think it's great to have our guest here today, and I'm so excited to share her with you. Her name is Rachael Penchoen-Lind. I apologize, Rachel. I should have asked how to pronounce it. Was that close?
It's close. It's pension. It's easier than it looks.
Okay. I was going for the French version. So she is a senior manager of site operations at Clara Health. And we're going to talk about clinical trials today because I think it's so important. And the whole process of clinical trials can be really challenging and overwhelming if you don't know what is going on. And so that's why Clara Health, Rachel's company, was established. It's a health tech company which eases the burdens placed on patients and caregivers who are really trying to get in the clinical trial process to learn about them and figure it all out. And so for me, my both times my cancer was fairly cut and dry, standard, boom, boom, boom. Wasn't really any need for me to participate in clinical trials. So I just think it's great that we're here to share this today. So Rachael, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this field? Because it seems really specialized.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Michelle. As you said, I'm the senior manager of site operations at Clara Health. And so what that means is that I work closely with sites that have clinical trials going on at them. And what a site is a hospital, a doctor's office, clinics, anywhere that a clinical trial is taking place. So I work closely with them to make sure things are going smoothly at their site with patients and anything on the back end, those sorts of things. And how I got into this field, when I graduated college, I graduated with a bachelor's in biology, and I needed a job. And so I started working in a lab, actually here in Portland at OHSU, that did research on cancer, and it was primarily breast and ovarian cancers. And that was working in a lab, like doing the bench research is what we call it. So like preclinical, not working with patients. And that was interesting, but I realized that it wasn't really what excited me. I wanted to work in kind of more of the patient field. And the lab that I worked in, our principal investigator, so the person who ran the lab, also worked in a lot of clinical trials. And so I started to get involved in some of the ones he was doing, and expressed interest in that and started kind of working on those within his team, and then moved within OHSU, working on different clinical trials in a different department, and then kind of came to Clara Health about a year ago. So that's sort of the short story of how I got involved.
Got it. So what can you explain actually what the definition of what a clinical trial is?
Yeah, so kind of basic at its core, a clinical trial is a medical research involving people. So I mentioned that I worked in a lab in preclinical. So that's when it's not involving people. But once we start talking about clinical trials, it's research involving people. And they basically show us what's effective in medicine and healthcare. They have volunteers help researchers look at new ways to prevent, detect, or treat conditions, and can also look at ways to, we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think, of different kinds of trials, but they can be ways to just observe how people are doing, not necessarily using medications, but, basically, like I said, at its core, it's medical research involving people.
Sure. And I would assume we need them because we're trying to help stop the spread of disease, trying to stop, cancers or other things from getting more aggressive. Is that the gist of it, basically?
Yeah, so that is definitely one of the reasons. And, before a treatment can be approved for use and made accessible to patients, the FDA requires that the therapy's safety and efficacy is evaluated in clinical trials. So this is a way to do that. And it also can make new treatments available. So even if there's a treatment that's maybe fairly effective for treating something, there might be a lot of side effects. And so clinical trials can help us find new ways to treat diseases and new ways to use medications that are already approved for one thing for something else.
Well, I really hope they continue doing them on the medication that I'm on, because man, the side effects suck.
Yeah. And that's exactly one reason. It's like, hey, maybe it's effective, but the side effects make it so that people don't want to take it. And so sometimes they'll do combination therapies and see if those work better, or just finding if there are better ways to do things than what we have right now.
Got it. Totally makes sense. What are the different phases of trials, and how are they conducted safely? Because I imagine there are risks.
Totally. So trials are run in multiple steps, and they're called phases, and they build on one another. And each phase helps to answer different questions. But the safety and efficacy is always being looked at, no matter what phase we're in. So a phase 1 trial is the first one. And it's basically, its main use is to find out if a new treatment is safe for people, and also to help hone in on the proper dose. So there's less of a focus on efficacy, less of a focus on if it's actually working for the intended purpose, although that's still looked at, but safety is the main purpose. And I should say too, that before we get to a phase 1 trial, there's lots of research on cells, on animals. It's not like we're like, just try this and see if it's safe on people. Like
throw it against the wall and see if it sticks.
Right. Like there has to be like a good reason to think it's safe in people before we go into this. This phase 1 can also help figure out the best method of giving a drug in some cases. So like IV or by mouth, just depending. So phase 1s are generally about 15 to 50 patients. So smaller.
Okay.
And they're often called, or they often use something called a dose escalating model. And so what this means is you're kind of placed into cohorts of X number of patients. So, say if there's 15, it's often 5, 5, and 5. The first 5 will receive a low dose. And then once all 5 of those patients have been in the study and gotten the medication, they'll look at the data, make sure that it's safe. And then the next 5 will receive a slightly higher dose. And then the next 5 slightly higher. So sometimes they do that dose escalating model to kind of see, and they can also then look at if there's different side effects that come up at different doses. And if they find that one dose isn't tolerated super well, then they don't go to the next one, so they can adjust. And in a phase 1, there also won't be placebos at all. So phase 2 then focuses more on effectiveness. Side effects are still closely watched. And like I said, safety is something that's looked at the entire time, but phase 2's, main focus is this drug, or is this intervention, not always a drug, effective? They're generally less than 100 people. And they usually use the dose and method found to be the safest and most effective in phase 1. Usually everyone gets the same dose, but occasionally there will be groups getting different doses or using different methods. Like maybe one group will take it by mouth and one group will get it intravenously to kind of see the balance of safety and effectiveness. Again, there's not usually placebos in a phase 2. And because there are more patients in a phase 2 than a phase 1, we might see less common side effects come up that weren't necessarily observed in a phase 1 trial, because, say only 1% of patients have a certain side effect, that's 1 in 100. If we had a trial,
that would be me.
There you go. If we had a trial with 15, we might not have had you in it.
Right.
And so that, might be something that doesn't come up until phase 2. So again, safety and side effects are still watched very closely. In a phase 3 trial, the new treatment is compared with the standard treatment generally. Okay. So these usually have hundreds of people in them. And this is usually where we have a split into groups. So there could be like a control group and a study group. Those are maybe some words that people have heard when you hear about clinical trials. And this is where also placebos can come into play. Generally, they won't. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later too. Generally, they're not really used very much in cancer clinical trials because of it has to be ethical to use a placebo. You can't just say like, you don't get treatment. But sometimes what can happen is there could be a group, for example, that receives standard of care plus a placebo, or the other group receives the new or standard of care plus the new treatment. There can be some things there, but in a phase 3, patients are randomly assigned to groups, and this has to be random. The doctor running it doesn't get to decide, nothing like that. It reduces bias. You don't want to have, their doctor's neighbor is in the trial and they get the new treatment.
Right. I think we've all seen this on Grey's Anatomy.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. I was going to say that. And I was like, well, I don't know if anyone knows. Right. So that's like totally bad.
100%.
That's like not allowed at all. As we know, because she got in trouble on Grey's Anatomy. But so patients are randomly assigned to groups, and then they'll be either getting the standard of care or the new treatment. There's also probably some other words that you've heard thrown around, like single blind, double blind. These get, a little bit more into the nitty gritty of it, but essentially a single blind trial is where a patient doesn't know what group they're in, but the doctor does know, or the person running the trial knows. And a double blind is where neither of them
knows. Okay.
Nobody knows. Yeah. There's of course, there's always somebody on the study that's unblinded because someone has to know, but that's where the doctor and
the researcher back in the office, they're opening the envelopes and saying, okay, I got this.
Yes. And has to administer the drug. And I've worked on double blind studies too. And you have to have like a whole thing where somebody's covering up what the drug is. And, there's a lot of things, because sometimes a new treatment looks different than the standard of care. Like one is a larger volume. So there's a lot that goes into it of actually keeping it blinded, but it's really important because a lot of biases can come into play if it's supposed to be a blinded trial and somebody finds out that what they're
I could not work on those because my face shows everything. So if I knew and they weren't getting it, I'd be like, I'm so sorry.
That's why I like being on the double blind, because then you're like, I really don't know. And so there's also a phase 4 trial. This one is okay. So after phase 3, if it goes well, it'll go to the FDA and be approved. Phase 4 looks at drugs that have already been approved by the FDA and continues to look at long-term benefits and effects. So these are often a little bit less time consuming in many ways, because it's a little bit more observational and just over time. And these can have thousands of people in it, and just looking long-term. Are there any long-term benefits, long-term side effects that we didn't see in the initial 3 studies? A couple of things about them, drugs only move on to the next phase if the phase before it has shown to be safe and effective. So if a phase 2, it's not effective or it's not safe, we're not going to move them on just for the heck of it. And the FDA is constantly monitoring things. The patient safety is really paramount in all of this. And also, I kind of mentioned this before, these aren't phases of clinical trials, but preclinical and lab trials happen before we get into phase 1, before we even get into humans. And so those generally start with cell studies, which is there's just all these cell lines of different types of cancers, some from animals, some from humans. We test on those, and then they often go into animals and then humans.
How long do these phases last normally?
A long time. I mean, I can't remember what the average is, but I think it can be 10, 15, 20 years to get through like the entire process.
Holy crap.
Yeah. I mean, there's, and you have to remember, there's also tons of paperwork, and you're working with groups like the FDA and government groups where things are slow. And so I think sometimes like when we talk about like the COVID vaccine and people like things are so expedited, and it's like, well, because something that usually takes 3 months to get a signature, they got it the day they turned it in.
Well, and what a lot of people don't realize too is that the early parts of these trials have been going on for years. And that's why all of the people who aren't so on board, they're like, well, it just appeared overnight. Well, no, it actually didn't, because it's based on so many other things.
Exactly.
So science, #science.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right.
My own personal belief, not of anyone else. Get vaccinated. So what are the different kinds of clinical trials out there?
Yeah. So there's 2 main ones. The first one is interventional, and that's what I think most people think of when they think of a clinical trial. And so this is a study that includes a medical, surgical, or behavioral intervention. So this is adding something. Could be a drug, could be a medical device, could be a new behavior like exercise therapy, etc. But this is adding something new in. Often patients can access treatments that are not yet available through standard of care. And these test the new ways or the new treatments or the new ways of using existing treatments. A type of study that I think less people know about is called observational. And this is generally something where they won't have the patients in the trial change anything, but they'll just be observing the patient, their health, whatever metrics they're looking at to observe or to either learn more about their condition, learn more about whatever treatment they're on, learn more about something that they're already doing in their life. But basically, intervention is adding something new, and observational is just watching what you are currently doing.
Got it. Now, we were going to take a break here in a minute, but I have one question before. What kind of consent do people need to give for trials? Like, how much information are they given? And is there some stuff that's held back?
So no, there should be nothing that's held back. And this is I have a lot of information I can give you on this. So we might have to go into after break on this one. But, some people I think that informed consent is just getting a signature on a consent form, but that's just a piece of the process. True informed consent means that the patient fully understands the trial and what they're signing. One thing when I was actively getting people's consent when I worked in my previous job was that a patient should be able to summarize the trial back to you. They should be able to understand it that well because they need to know what they're signing up for.
Right.
And so, you asked, is any information held back? It shouldn't be. I mean, if there's a blinded trial, of course, we can't tell you what drug you're getting, but there should be nothing held back as far as risks, purpose, the length it's expected to take, any possible benefits, discomforts, procedures, anything like that, who to contact with any questions, concerns. You should be given any and all information. And you should also know it's voluntary and that you can leave the trial at any time. Just because you sign a consent doesn't mean you're in it and can't leave.
I love what you said about the paragraph, like them being able to repeat the paragraph of information back to you. I think that really kind of sums it up. Like you need to know everything and you be able to spout it back. So you've learned the information. So that's really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to take a short break. Listeners, remember, you can make a donation on our website or by texting BF Radio to 41444 to help Breast Friends continue on its mission to ensure that women don't go through cancer alone. You can also learn more about Clara Health at clarahealth.com. And also, listeners, if you or someone out there needs help with our Breast Friends programs, please go to patient programs and our website and check them out. So stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Hello and welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Michelle Beck and my guest is Rachael Penchoen-Lind. She's the senior manager of site operations at Clara Health. And we've been talking about clinical trials. So much good information so far, Rachael. Thank you. But let's get into trials with breast cancer. I'm sure there are, how many trials actually are going on at any given time usually?
Thousands, tens of thousands. I couldn't even tell you. I mean, there's trials that for every indication out there, every disease process, everything. I mean, so many.
So, what about, so I'm sure there are specific ones for breast cancer, but also, are there separate trials for metastatic breast cancer? Because it's such an important thing right now. More and more women are being diagnosed metastatic, and it's just the amount of funding that goes into metastatic is so disgusting. It's just the numbers are rising, and it's like 8% of the funding. So I'm hoping there are a lot of clinical trials out there for that.
There are definitely clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer out there. Off the top of my head, I don't know any of them just to spout off, but there's definitely clinical trials for metastatic breast cancer. There's clinical trials for, I would say, every phase. There's ones that are looking at how we can have better early detection, in blood tests. And then there's ones in every single phase, every single type of breast cancer, including metastatic. But I do agree that the funding for it is abysmal.
Yeah. I don't know any, I mean, there's a lot of awful words to describe it, but I have lost in our organization so many young women this year to metastatic cancer, and it just breaks my heart. So anything we can do to really help that going forward, especially for triple negative, which has just been awful this year. But let's go back to the placebo question. So say someone is enrolled in a clinical trial for breast cancer. Like you talk about receiving the placebo versus the new type of care and standard of care and all that. How does that work? Because you still want to help people.
Yes. So placebos are rarely used in cancer treatment clinical trials because, like you said, you want to help people. You can't just say, take this placebo, which is often looked at as like a sugar pill. It's not a medication. There's a couple cases where a placebo could be used in a cancer clinical trial. Generally what it is like if a patient is receiving, there's two groups. So like in a phase 3 trial, which I mentioned before, if there's two groups, one group is receiving the standard of care. So they're still receiving treatment, and they're receiving the treatment they would receive even if they're not in a clinical trial, plus a placebo. And then another group is receiving the standard of care plus a new treatment. And that could compare, like, is the new treatment in addition to the standard of care better than just the standard of care and placebo? But you can't use a placebo in a clinical trial if it's not ethical. You can't just say, like, let's see what happens if we give them nothing, because we know that it won't be good. Right. Like that's not ethically appropriate. And, I think sometimes placebo has been used, like people just think clinical trial, placebo, and that's not necessarily the case. And like I said, in cancer clinical trials, it's actually fairly rare to use a placebo because of the ethical piece of it. And
that's good to hear.
Yes. And a placebo would not be used if there's a highly effective or potentially curative therapy available to patients. But again, like the way that it would be used the most in cancer clinical trials is if you're comparing it as like an addition to a standard of care versus a new treatment. So you're still receiving the care that you would receive outside of a clinical trial, but you might just be getting something in addition to that, if that makes sense.
100%. Now, what are the potential costs associated to a patient for enrolling in a clinical trial? Because all of this costs money. And do the patients have to pay?
Oftentimes, no. So usually clinical trials will be entirely covered by the person running it or the group running it. Sometimes or oftentimes things that are standard of care, like blood tests and things that you would receive even if you weren't in the trial, will still be covered by insurance. Okay. Of course, we run into issues if people don't have insurance, and that's a kind of, you can get into like very specific case scenarios, which we won't do here. But if you're receiving something in a clinical trial that isn't standard of care, that's usually entirely free to you, and it should be covered by the trial. There are some exceptions, and that's trial specific, but all of that would be disclosed to you like when you're doing the informed consent process. So you should know if there would be any costs associated with any of the trials that you'd be doing or any of the treatment you'd be getting. Another thing is there could potentially be extra visits if you're in a clinical trial. So if, for example, you live far away, you have to travel, parking, those are all questions too. Some trials will cover travel costs for you. Some will cover food, parking, those sorts of things, and some don't. So these are all things that would be disclosed to you during the informed consent process before you even sign the consent form. But those ones can be a little bit study specific, whether or not they'll cover kind of the travel costs.
Sure. Now, if someone is interested in participating in a clinical trial at no matter what stage they're in their cancer treatment, and their oncologist doesn't mention it, how do you know if a trial is right for you, or how do you find something?
Yeah. So, if your oncologist doesn't mention it, you can always bring it up to them. Say, do you know of any trials that are going on? Clara Health also has a great free resource. So clinicaltrials.gov is the place that people have always gone. That's not Clara Health. That's just sort of, that's where all the clinical trials that are going on are listed. That's like at any time, but it's a really clunky website and it's very difficult to navigate, even if you
most of the government websites are.
Right. Even if you are computer savvy, it's, difficult to navigate. And then if you're not, then I don't even know how anyone would do it. And so that's sort of one of the things that Clara Health is trying to, make clinical trials more accessible. So we do have a free resource that you can go on and talk to people from our team, and they can help find clinical trials. If it's not a trial that we're specifically working on, we can't do any of the screening and stuff, but we can always help direct you to
Sure.
the contact they have listed. So those are ways that you could find them. You can always look to like at your, oncology center at a local hospital. They generally have, like OHSU is our local one. You can look up OHSU clinical trials and they have a page that has all of them listed that they have going on. So those are a couple options.
Nice. Now for me as a survivor who would want to help, how would I be a part of a clinical trial to help future patients?
Yeah. So there could be a lot of different ways. So I know you mentioned that you're on a medication and have side effects that are very unpleasant. Sounds like, there could be observational studies for those. So those would be like looking at, just how you're tolerating that medication side effects. I don't know if there's actually one going on for that, but that's just like an option of things. There are also lots of trials for survivors looking at either observational or interventional things. I've heard of ones, for interventional, for example, having behavioral changes, like potentially there's been, I've seen mindfulness ones. So things like meditation, therapy, exercise, yoga. And so there also could be, some other observational ones, but there's definitely, I think it can be a common misconception that people think that clinical trials are only for people that are getting treatment for a disease actively or actively have something that's being treated. But clinical trials and survivors are really useful as well, because that's, it's important to not just be like, your treatment's done, we're not looking at anything anymore. We want to keep looking at people.
Another thing to add to survivorship, because it's really challenging. Now we all know that cancer does not just happen to the patient, it happens to families and caregivers. How can caregivers give the support to their family members or friends who are going through a trial?
Yeah. So one thing that I didn't mention when we were talking about informed consent too, is that a caretaker, family member, friend, whoever can be with you. And I would recommend that they are with you when they talk about it. So they could always, be there with you to hear about the trial. They could help ask some questions that might not come up for you. They can always be there for that. They could help search for trials for you. There are also trials with caretakers, either caretakers and patients together. I know some trials that or at the institution that I used to work at that have caretaker and patient exercise classes, for example. And then there's also ones that are just caretaker too, and those can be observational or intervention too. So I've seen observational ones of just kind of, tracking how they're doing potentially like mental health through the process.
Right. The mental health of taking care of the mental health of caretakers is so important. And it's something that's really not done enough, because when I went through it, it was interesting. I had a show last summer with my husband and my sister about my main caretakers and how they handled my cancer treatments. And it was really interesting. They completely did it in different ways. My husband, former military, very cut and dry. This is the way it was like, okay, we're going to do this. This is what's happening. I'm going to blah, 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 step, step, step. And my sister literally lived in a world of denial. She's like, you're fine. You're good. We're getting through this. But both of them helped me. But I know from talking to them, my second diagnosis was 5 years ago this week, actually. 5 years. Woo, woo.
Yeah, congrats.
But it was really interesting talking to them later on at this point to find out how it affected them and how they process. Like my sister actually spent a lot of time talking to her therapist about it, because she was always super positive with me, but then the reality, she went back to her therapist and was like, this is awful. Like, she's my person. How do I get through this? Whereas my husband, he was so used to processing and compartmentalizing that he just powered through.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, funny is probably not the right word, but seeing how people deal with it differently, but there's a lack of support, I think, for caretakers along the process. And we just kind of throw them in and say, figure it out. Right. And so your husband and sister clearly figured it out in their own way, but that doesn't mean that it was right, that they didn't have more support throughout the process. And it's fantastic that your sister had a therapist to at least like talk to about it. But if we had more resources, like, in the oncologist office, like that should be something that's like, okay, you've been diagnosed and here's how we're going to support you, but also here's how we're going to support your caregiver. And so clinical trials, are a great way to start to, talk about the different things that we can do and figure out what is actually beneficial.
Sure. And I imagine that is the main point of doing the clinical trials, is helping future patients. I mean, yes, it can help us with our treatments going forward, but with the time frames that it takes, like if it can take years, like I have 5 more years on my medication because I'm on the 10-year plan because I've had it twice, same type, blah, blah, blah. But so for me, it's not really going to help, but for others out there, for the younger women and, people are going to get diagnosed in the future, I imagine that's why we want to do these things.
So both, yeah, yes, like definitely wanting to help future people that have the same diagnosis as you. That's definitely a big reason. And I think too, like some people think that clinical trials won't help them and will only help people in the future. And that's not necessarily true, especially with,
metastatic patients too, probably. That if they find another kind of treatment that they're on, that's really going to help prolong their life and their quality of life. That is a huge bonus.
Yeah. And, things like observational studies, obviously those things are probably more to help people down the line because they're not actually having interventions. But for trials where people are trying new medications, new devices, new behavioral interventions, those can help people during the trial. And that can also give, the people that are in the trial access to medications or things like that wouldn't be normally accessible because they're not FDA approved yet. So it can help you while you're doing it, and then also can help people down the line as well.
Totally makes sense. Now we talked a little bit about this, and can you actually give the landing site for your free resource of the clinical trials at Clara?
Yeah.
So if someone wanted to get started on that, because yes, you can go to clarahealth.com and search, but and the clinicaltrials.gov, are those the two? Well, obviously Clara, yes, but other than clinicaltrials.gov, which is hard to navigate, how do you, do you just Google that shit? Sorry, that's our phrase in my house, GTS.
That's funny. I love that. So with the Clara Health one, you can Google Clara Health or go to clarahealth.com, and in the top right corner it says find a study. And so that's just what you'd click on. There is also a breast cancer specific finder for trials, and that's breastcancertrials.org. I haven't played a lot on that one, so I don't know how accessible it is, but my understanding is that's kind of specifically the one that patient advocacy groups and patients with breast cancer use, just because then you don't have to look through trials that aren't for your type of cancer or your, or even things that aren't even cancer.
Got it. Totally makes sense. Now how long have you been working in with the patients in the clinical trials? I know you kind of started out in the lab. Over that time, do you work with patients, or like, what is your, do you have any specific experiences that you can really talk about in terms of how it has, affected patients or helped people?
Yeah. So I'm not actively working with patients right now. I kind of peripherally work with them, but have before. It really is meaningful when you see that a patient feels like they've been given access to something or had a really good time in a clinical trial. Something that stands out to me, and this isn't actually related to the cancer clinical trials that I worked on, but is related to just sort of like patient centricity around trials, is that I worked in the anesthesia department for a little bit and worked closely with an anesthesiologist who was specifically trained in obstetric anesthesia. And so we had some trials on labor and delivery. And I worked on some that we were in C-sections, and the thing that we didn't happen until after the baby was out and after the placenta was out. So we kind of just like stood around for a while. And I would always offer to take pictures with the parents, either phone or camera. And like, they would always be so happy, like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Because everyone else in the room has a job. Like they're giving you your anesthesia, or they're getting the baby out. Like they're not like, give me your phone, let me take a picture. But I was just kind of a warm body in the way. And so I'd be like, give me your camera, let me take pictures. And they were always so happy. And like, it was always fun for me because it's, it's exciting to see people become parents. It's a happy time. And it was just like such a fun thing, and reminded me sort of like, these are people, like, it's just a good reminder of like, these are people in your trial, and like the patient centricity, and what can I do for them? Like, I didn't have to take pictures for them, but why not? Like, and how can we make it a better experience for them and remind ourselves that they are people and they're patients, and, they're important. We have to keep that in the front of our minds, I think.
Okay. Side note. Always love my anesthesiologist, my best friends.
I had, one time I told an anesthesiologist, thank you for the best nap of my life, over and over and over after I came out of anesthesia. I don't remember it. I was just told that.
Well, Rachel, we do need to take another quick break. I want to remind listeners out there, if you would like to be a guest or send me your story of what inspired you, what helped you through your cancer, or how your life has changed for the better, please email me at michellebeck@breastfriends.org. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Michelle Beck, and my guest is Rachael Penchoen-Lind, Senior Manager of Site Operations at Clara Health, who really make clinical trials easy for those of you out there. So if you're interested, please check out their website. We're talking about why it matters to breast cancer patients and survivors and what we can do to help with and all the ins and outs. Rachel, what are some of the common assumptions that you think people make about trials that are true or not true?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one is that once you agree to participate in a trial that you can't change your mind. That's not true. Informed consent is an ongoing process, and it means that you can change your mind at any time for any reason. You can say like, hey, you know what? This was working for me and it's not anymore, and that's okay. There should be no coercion to stay in a study if you bring it up. It's really helpful if you are in a trial and decide to leave to let them know, and also to maybe give them a little bit of insight why, just because say they have like 10 people who leave and it's all because the time commitment's too much and no one tells them, then they can't make any changes. But, there should not be any like, are you sure? Why? Blah, like no coercion. Again, also I mentioned this before, like I'm nervous I'll receive a placebo. That is sometimes true and sometimes not. But I think how we talked about that, like you wouldn't receive a placebo and when there's a very good treatment available, that's not something you can only receive a placebo when it's ethical.
Now, are there ever therapists or counselors involved in the process that the patients can talk to about their fears or anxiety about the trial or what they're going through?
That's a good question. So in my experience, there hasn't been like therapists or counselors on the kind of staff of the clinical trial. That would be something that I would love to see happen more.
Huge proponent for that, because so many people don't have others to talk to, and especially if they're going through something like this. I'm a huge proponent of therapy and getting out those emotions. And a lot of times families and caregivers, while they might be supportive, they don't understand exactly what is going on, which is why we're huge advocates of finding, if it's not a therapist or a counselor, find your tribe, find your group who you can talk to. Which leads me to another question. Do patients in the trials, can they connect with other patients, or are they usually kept separate?
That's a good question too. Oftentimes they're not actively placed together, but if it's something that you would be interested in, it's a possibility. I think also for trials, like for example, for breast cancer, other types of cancers, that would be something that would potentially be more common. And that would definitely be something that you could ask either the study staff, the principal investigator, so like the doctor running the trial, or just another member of the study staff, like, hey, could I be in contact with other people from the trial? You could also, offer up like, can you let people know that I want to be in contact? They would have to, kind of be the in-between at first to make sure, not just like, here's everyone's information.
Right.
But that would definitely be something I think that could be helpful for support as well. And, I'm a huge proponent for therapy for everybody, but I think sometimes too, if you were at like a large institution, you might be able to request you speak to like a social worker as well. But that would be one of the things I would love to see, is like a therapist on staff for a clinical trial to be able to talk to patients.
I mean, obviously I know 2 years into a pandemic, we're really in short supply on therapists, but something to look forward to, because the pandemic will end.
Yeah. Right. Yes, exactly.
So what do you wish more people knew about clinical trials? Like because I think the knowledge is power, thank you, Schoolhouse Rock, but how do you get the word out there and to really clear up any misconceptions, or, what do you want to tell more people?
Yeah. I want to tell people that they're not just a last resort. I think clinical trials are often looked at as like, I've tried everything and I'm going to a clinical trial as a last resort. That's not always the case. They can be really, really early on. And, like we've talked about all the different kinds of trials. Also that you as a patient have power in the clinical trial. I think that, in the medical field in general, there can be a power imbalance where the patient feels like they can't speak up. I'm sure you know that.
Yes.
And I'm sure most of the listeners here know that as well. And especially in clinical trials, I think people can feel like, I feel like a guinea pig, like, I feel like I can't speak up, but that's not the case. Like, you have power in the clinical trial. A clinical trial doesn't happen without patients. And, I want people to feel empowered to speak up if they feel like there's something that's funky, and, ask questions. Like, you should feel empowered to know that you don't need to just do what you're told without speaking up and asking about it. Like, I think that that's one thing I really want patients to realize, like, how much power they have, and to take that back and like feel empowered. I just keep saying empowered, but
but it's so true. That's one thing we talk about all the time, is being your own advocate, because there is something that's called the good patient syndrome. So we go into the office and we're with our medical team and our oncologist, and there's that part of the brain that's like, okay, my doctor knows what's going on. They've studied this. They've been a doctor for so long, and they're going to ask me these questions, and I'm gonna be like, okay, yes, I will do whatever you say. And yes, we should trust them and believe in them. But if something seems odd to you, ask questions, get second opinions. And just because they are your oncologist or someone on your medical team does not mean that what they're talking about is right for you. And especially they are human. And especially with, hey, that's the beauty of live podcasting and like
my hands.
Any day I expect my screen to fall over, my dogs to come in and jump on me, and my son to come in. So, those are the good times.
They're just humans too, right? Like, we should trust physicians and scientists and stuff, but you also need to feel like you're being listened to and you're being heard, and not everyone's right for everybody. Like, maybe that doctor it doesn't mean they're bad at their job, or
just might not be a good fit. And that's the same, I imagine, with clinical trials. You can go in, you can learn about it. And as you said, at any point in the process, you can be like, this is no longer for me. And, hopefully you give them the knowledge of why it doesn't work for you, and then you can move on.
Yes. And I remember so many patients who would tell me, oh, I'm so sorry, this just doesn't feel right for me to do right now. I'm like, that's fine. Don't apologize. Like, thanks for letting me know.
Really, we have so much going on, whether it's in treatment, post-treatment, doing a clinical trial. And yes, if you're in active treatment and you're really trying to find something that will help you going forward, great, but that still might not be right for you. The side effects might be too much, or the emotions of it. And, even post-treatment, it's like you said, you're not locked in. This is not prison. This is a choice, and you're doing it to help yourself or others, but you don't have to. So being your own advocate and really saying, I am important here, listen to me, answer my questions so I can make the right decision.
Yeah. And I think some people feel too that, like, the notion of this clinical trials to help other people down the line. Some people feel like, well, then I should do it because I should want to help people that come after me. And it's great if you want to, and you feel like great, but you don't have to. There's no should in it. Like, if it feels right for you, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay. You have to be kind of all in on it, and like, you're not all in, but you have to feel right about it.
It's funny. I've definitely heard from many, self-help people that should be taken out of our vocabulary, because it's like, it's, if you should do something, it's like,
then you don't want to.
Yeah.
Right.
So what do you hope to see in the future? What sort of shifts or advancements in clinical trials are foremost in your mind that you would like to see?
Yeah. We mentioned things like the therapist, there's just so much patient centricity that I would love to see. Clinical trials have been around for a long time, and, this is similar in medicine, but sometimes people are resistant to change, and so things like COVID kind of sped up, for all the bad things that happened with it. They did make things happen a little faster in some ways, like telehealth. A lot of people were really, really, really resistant to telehealth and clinical trials too. And so I hope that that's something that becomes more available when you just have a visit that you don't have to have any tests done, or, that can be done via telehealth. It's so much easier for a lot of patients, particularly if someone's rural, has to travel a long way. Like, that would be great. Or being able to do home health, or allow patients to see a physician or somebody closer to them. Making it more accessible for patients, like a lot of the appointments are 9 to 5. So we don't get patients that have like 9 to 5 jobs without flexibility, which tends to be patients that are in lower socioeconomic status. That skews results. If we're only having wealthy people in trials, or people that have flexible jobs, that does skew results. Making it standard to cover things like transportation for patients. I mentioned some trials will cover transportation, some won't. Again, making it standard to do that will allow more people to be in trials. If somebody can't afford an Uber to the hospital and they can't be in the trial, that's, in my opinion, a really terrible reason to not allow someone in a trial. But that's what happens, and it's a problem from above. There's a lack of funding for a lot of these things, but we just need to make it more commonplace. We need to make trials way more accessible. We need to build trust in communities of color that have so often felt or have been tested on by the medical field, and for good reason don't want to involve themselves in clinical trials because they don't have trust. There's a lot of, I think, things are happening, but sometimes I feel like there's some lip service of we want to diversify your trials and make them more accessible. And then when you say okay, great, here's tangible things you can do, it's oh, maybe not that. That's a lot of work. And, of course, money is a thing, and it can be hard to get the funding, but these are things that I really want to see and become more accessible, and just the patient centricity piece of it, putting the patients at the front of our mind, and what can we do that's best for the patients? How can we make this the best possible experience for them? Can we get a therapist to talk to them about it? Because maybe they don't have somebody to talk about it with at home, or they don't want to burden somebody, whatever. We just need to make these really commonplace, I think.
Now, where does the most of the funding come from? Are these big pharma companies that are sponsoring these trials?
So there's different types of trials, but pharma companies are sponsoring a lot of them. There's also a lot of government funding. There's kind of two main types of trials. One is called a investigator-initiated trial. So that's if a physician, for example, has an idea for a trial, they go and find funding for it. And usually it's just at one hospital, their hospital, and they're running it. Or there's bigger sponsor trial, which is where a pharma company or something has a drug or whatever, and they have many, many different hospitals running them. But so generally money comes from pharma companies, government, and then sometimes there's also patient advocacy or specific disease groups that have some types of funding for trials, but there's always a lack of funding, which is also why, like I said, it's a big problem. It's we can't pay for transportation if we're barely making ends meet on paying the staff, but that's a problem. We need to normalize having funding for all this extra stuff, because I don't think it's extra. I think it should be standard.
Right, because a patient is going through treatment, they're already putting out so much out of pocket costs, and even for me, my husband was working, I was a stay-at-home mom, but we had a $5,000 deductible. No one has $5,000 extra just sitting around that you have to pay your medical bills for. And then if you're expected to pay for, part of a clinical trial, it's going to be above and beyond. And we're in, a middle-class white family who has resources. So it's kind of crazy out there.
Yep.
But so yes, more funding. So we have 1 minute left. How can listeners find out more? Again, we've covered this, but please iterate again how to find Clara Health and clinical trials.
Yeah. So clarahealth.com, up in the top right corner, it'll say find a study. That's one place you can go. And there's always a chat box there that you can talk to a real person that can help you find trials. It's all free. Basically, it's about making trials more accessible. We really want people to have access to trials. This company started because one of our founders saw a poster for I believe it was a breast cancer clinical trial hanging up somewhere. And she was I cannot believe this is how people are finding trials. This is obscene. Just by luck, you saw the poster. We need to make it easier for people to find trials. I mentioned breastcancertrials.org is another website that's specific for breast cancer. If you want to do a little bit more of your own searching, talk to your doctors, talk to your oncologists. A lot of times they do know, even if they're not necessarily bringing it up, they often are privy to trials. And, you can always look on the website of your local hospital as well. Again, you have to do a little more digging yourself, but those are all different ways of looking.
Perfect. Rachel, so much good information today about clinical trials and Clara Health. And reminder patients, be your own advocate. So again, listeners, thank you so much for being here today. If you or a loved one need our services, please visit breastfriends.org. You can make a donation on our website or by texting BF Radio to 41444 to help ensure that women do not go through cancer alone. You can find our show on many platforms on Voice America Health and Wellness channel, or search Breast Friends wherever you listen to your podcasts. And now we're going to be on YouTube, so you can search us there too. If you want to nominate yourself to be my guest or submit your warrior story, I'm at Michelle Beck at breastfriends.org. We'll be back next week. And until then, remember, we rise by lifting each other.